Madam President.
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. And let me concur with much of what my colleague Senator Shaheen has just said. But let me begin by doing something that we don't do enough, I think, and that is to say thank you to the 2 million civilians and 1.4 million men and women in the military of 50 states, including some 5,000 in my own state of Vermont. So we have 2 million civilians who are working for the federal government and 1.4 million men and women in the military. We owe them a deep debt of gratitude. And the work that they do is enormously important for our country. They work to make sure that our drinking water and the air that we breathe is safe. It is not an accident that in many parts of this country, the air that people are breathing, that our kids are breathing, is a lot cleaner than it used to be. It took a lot of work to make that happen, and we thank them for that. We have customs people today patrolling our borders, and we thank them for their work. We have federal workers who protect the health and safety of working people all over the country. We have federal workers who are working today educating kids with special needs. We have federal employees who provide food to low-income pregnant women, infants, children, and senior citizens. We have federal employees today who are working in VA hospitals, and we have nurses there and many other staff doing a great job for our veterans. We have federal employees who make sure that children receive needed care and services so that their parents can go to work. They repair our roads and bridges, dams, culverts, sewers, and schools. They sweep the floors. They clean our bathrooms and make sure that the buildings we work in are not infested. Americans who work for the federal government are part of the backbone of this country, and I personally thank them for what they do. But it is no secret that in recent years there has been a huge assault against the federal workforce. For the past 3 years, the pay of federal workers has been frozen at a time when the cost that they are incurring in terms of gasoline, heating oil, prescription drugs, everything else has been going up, but their pay has been level. And now, as a thank you for all of the work that federal employees do here in Washington and Vermont, Massachusetts, all over this country, our thank you to them has been to shut down the government and to tell some 800,000 federal employees, these are single moms trying to raise kids, these are proud people, civilians in the military, people in our National Guards, these are people who are doing important work, who have families to raise, who are dedicated to their jobs, and we're saying, sorry, you have to go home. And they're going home, and they're not even sure whether they are going to be paid or when they are going to be paid. So you're looking at tens of thousands of lives that are being radically disrupted because of this shutdown. I can tell you, Madam President, that in Vermont we are very proud of the Vermont National Guard. Vermont National Guard men and women served very heavily and bravely in Iraq and Afghanistan. They helped us when we had this terrible Irene floods a few years ago. And the thank you that the Vermont National Guard is getting today, and this is true all over the country, is that in Vermont some 450 workers at the Vermont National Guard are going to be furloughed. And I know many of these people, they are good people, they are hardworking people, they just don't deserve this type of behavior from the federal government. And this affects people from all over the state, people who are trying to get homes, people who are trying to start businesses. And that's not something that should be happening. Madam President, let me just very briefly explain the dynamic of what's going on right here. And it is not complicated. The Republicans in the House are dominated by a relatively small group of right-wing extremists. And what the Speaker there has said is that instead of bringing the bill that we passed here in the Senate, what's called the Clean CR, that will continue funding the government, instead of putting that bill on the floor of the House and allowing the entire 435 members of the House to vote on that bill, what he has done is said to the House Republicans, okay, what do you want? And the extreme right wing has dominated that, and what they have said is, we want to defund Obamacare. And that's the only legislation you, Mr. Speaker, can bring to the floor of the House. And this is a moment of enormous importance for the Speaker of the House. And he has to determine whether he is the Speaker of the Republican Party or the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, whether he's going to be dominated by a minority of one party in one part of the government, or that he will allow the entire House to vote. And what many observers have made clear is if he puts that bill on the floor, it will pass and the government will reopen. And I hope that he will do that. Now, my political views, my progressive political views are pretty well known. My views on this issue are well known in Vermont, maybe elsewhere in the country. But what I want to do, Madam President, is very briefly tell you what some Republicans are saying, people who are not right-wing extremists, people who, in fact, who have very strong disagreements with the Affordable Care Act, but understand that you do not hold the American people hostage, you do not blackmail the government in order to get your way. So this is not Bernie Sanders talking. These are conservative Republicans, but people who are not right-wing extremists. Let me just quote some of my colleagues. These are the public statements that they have made. Saxby Chambliss, Republican senator from Georgia. This is what he says. Quote, I'd love to defund Obamacare too, but shutting down the government and playing into the hands of the president politically is not the right thing to do. Plus, it's going to do great harm to the American people if we pursue that course. We've been there. It didn't work. End of quote. Saxby Chambliss, Republican. Senator Dan Coates, Republican, Indiana. Quote, here's the hard truth. President Obama will not overturn his signature legislation so long as he is president and the Democrats have control of the Senate. Along with these political realities, refusing to pass legislation to keep the government funded will not stop Obamacare from going into effect. End of quote. Senator Dan Coates, Republican. Senator Tom Coburn, Republican, Oklahoma. Quote, it's not an achievable strategy. It's creating the false impression that you can do something when you can't, and it's dishonest. End of quote. Republican Senator Tom Coburn. Republican Senator Bob Corker, Tennessee. The Washington Post reports that Corker compared shutting down the government to a way that buffalo were slaughtered in the Old West. Quote, I know when you get led into a box canyon what that means. Box canyon, here we come. End of quote. Representative Peter King, Republican, New York. Quote, we should not be closing down the government under any circumstances. That doesn't work. It's wrong. And you know, Obamacare passed. We have to try to defund it. We have to try to find ways to repeal it. But the fact is, we shouldn't be using it as a threat to shut down the government. End of quote. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, Utah. Quote, my personal belief is the only way to get rid of Obamacare is to be intelligent and smart about it and gradually just work on it, work it through. To expect the government to shut down is not the way to do it. End of quote. Mark Kirk, Senator, Republican from Illinois, quote, I am one of those who says, let's not shut down the government just because you don't get everything you want. End of quote. Mark Kirk, Republican governor, Republican Senator, Illinois. Senator John McCain, former Republican candidate for President of the United States, quote, in the United States Senate, we will not repeal or defund Obamacare. We will not. And to think we can is not rational. End of quote. John McCain, Senator from Arizona. Senator Rob Portman, Republican of Ohio, quote, I do think we need to deal with the underlying problem of overspending, and we have to deal with the problem of Obamacare, but those ought to be handled outside of the context of a government shutdown. End of quote. Senator Jim Risch, Republican, Idaho, quote, there isn't anybody that thinks that Obamacare is going to get defunded. It cannot happen. We were elected to govern. You don't govern by shutting down the government. End of quote. I can go on and on and on. There are many, many Republicans here in the Senate, Republicans in the House, who do not like Obamacare, but they understand that you don't shut down the government just to make a point. You don't throw 800,000 workers who work for the federal government, whose lives depend on a paycheck, out on the street in order to make a point. I think Jim Risch, Republican senator from Idaho, had it right. Let me repeat what he said. Quote, "There isn't anybody that thinks that Obamacare is going to get defunded. It cannot happen. We were elected to govern. You don't govern by shutting down the government." End of quote. Senator Risch is exactly correct. So where we are right now is that you have many Republicans here in the Senate. You have Republicans in the House. You have millions of Republicans all over this country who say we have disagreements with Obamacare. But it was passed by the United States Congress almost 4 years ago, signed by the President. When it was challenged in the Supreme Court, it was upheld as being constitutional. We had a presidential election where the Affordable Care Act was one of the major issues being debated. Obama won by 5 million votes. We had Senate races. Republicans lost 2 seats in the Senate. They lost seats in the House. And you have sensible Republicans all over the country saying, look, there are ways to deal with this issue. But you don't shut down the government. You don't punish 800,000 workers. You do not deny benefits and services to tens and tens of millions of Americans. Madam President, I just want to go on another area and to suggest to you, although I think you well understand this, that what we're seeing today in terms of the attack on Obamacare is not just some isolated act on the part of right-wing Republicans. I think many Americans really are not aware. People who may like Obamacare, may not like Obamacare. And by the way, Madam President, as you well know, today was the first day the exchanges opened. And guess what happened? Millions of people went to the website. Guess what? When you have 48 million Americans who have no health insurance and millions more who are in need, have high deductibles and co-payments, and they're given the opportunity to get insurance, shock of all shock, many of them are now going to the website. And our Republican friends say, no, we don't want to see that. But the point here, and I hope everybody understands this, is that this attack on Obamacare is just one small part of a right-wing extremist ideology, which is incredibly reactionary and which really intends not just to repeal Obamacare, but to repeal virtually every major piece of legislation passed in this country in the last 80 years, which protects the interest of the elderly, the children, the sick, the poor, women, the environment, people who are vulnerable. That is what their agenda is. And let me just give you a few examples. The Environmental Protection Agency works hard to make sure that the air we breathe is clean. You have many right-wing Republicans who don't want to just cut funding for the EPA. They want to abolish the EPA. We have today a major crisis in this country in terms of millions of American workers being forced to work for very, very low wages. People are working for $8 an hour. They're working for $9 an hour. You can't raise a family working on these very, very low wages. Many of us believe that it's important that we raise the minimum wage. Well, you know what the right-wing agenda is? The agenda funded by people like the Koch brothers, a family worth $70 billion, who are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into these right-wing extremist groups. You know what they say about the minimum wage? They say, let's abolish the minimum wage. People think I'm kidding. I am not. The view now of the majority of the members, Republican members here in the Senate, in the House, is not only not raising the minimum wage, it is to abolish the concept of the minimum wage. And what that means, if you are living in a high unemployment area and the wages that are being offered to you by an employer are $3 an hour or $4 an hour, those are the wages you will have to accept because there will be no federal floor. Federal floor is now 7.25, much too low, but that's what it is. Get rid of that. and you're going to have people in this country working for $3 or $4 an hour. Madam President, one of the most significant pieces of federal legislation ever passed was passed in 1935, Social Security. Today we have over 50 million Americans who are benefiting from Social Security. If you go to the Texas Republican Party platform, their recent platform, and they are one of the most powerful Republican parties in the country, they are pretty upfront about what they believe. They want to end Social Security. They want to privatize it. That is their goal. The Veterans Administration, and I speak as chairman of the Veterans Committee. Today we have quite good VA health care through 152 medical centers run by the VA, 900 community-based outreach clinics, many vet centers. VA does, most veterans consider, a pretty good job in providing health care. You know what some Republicans want to do? They want to privatize the Veterans Administration. Check it out. Texas Republican Party platform, which speaks for Republicans all over this country. Madam President, it's not just the VA and it's not just Social Security. It is many, many other programs. We recently saw our friends over there in the House cut food stamps by some $4 billion this year. That's what they believe. Meanwhile, we have more people living in poverty today than at any time in the history of the United States, and many of these guys want to make devastating cuts in Medicaid, in food stamps, and in many other programs that the most vulnerable people in this country are living on. So, Madam President, let me conclude by saying this. We could end this crisis in a very few minutes. And all that has to happen is the Speaker of the House has to bring the clean bill that we passed here in the Senate and give all of his members a chance to vote on it. And if he does that, this crisis is over. It is morally wrong and it is extremely dangerous from a precedent perspective to allow this government and our president to be blackmailed or for the American people to be held in hostage. Because if we were to succumb and surrender to that blackmail today, I can absolutely guarantee you that in 2 weeks, when the United States is going to have to pay its debts, and we don't, for the first time in the history of this country, have the money to pay our debts, and when the economists are telling us that if we don't pay our debts, there could be an international economic crisis leading to huge amounts of job loss all over the world, not just in the United States. And if we surrender to these guys right now on this issue, they'll be back. They will be back and saying, well, if you don't cut this or you don't cut that, we are not going to allow you to pay the debts that the United States owes. And it will go on and on. And next year they will come back. And they may well say, well, we're not going to fund the government unless you end Social Security or unless you cut Medicaid drastically. That is not the way a government in a democratic, civilized society can operate. We have our disagreements. God only knows we have that, and we have debates. But there is a process. And what the Republicans have not yet recovered from is the simple fact that they lost the presidential election, they do not have control over the Senate, and they only have one body. And they think that controlling one body, they have a right to control the United States government. That's not how it works. So, Madam President, I would hope that people all over this country, whether they're conservatives or progressives, Democrats or Republicans, will listen to what some of the sensible Republicans right now are saying. And in essence, what they are saying, and I read many of the quotes, John McCain, many others, yeah, we have differences of opinion. And yeah, some of them disagree strongly with Obamacare. But there is a process that you go through to make those changes. You do not shut down the government, impact the entire economy, throw 800,000 people out of work, deny services to millions of Americans. That is not the way you run a government in a democratic society. So, Madam President, let me conclude by just hoping very much that the Speaker of the House will recognize that he is the Speaker of the entire House and not of just the Republican Party, and that he will let all of his members vote on the legislation that we passed right here in the Senate.
Madam President, before the Senator yields the floor, could I direct it? I would ask permission to direct a question through you to the distinguished senator from Vermont.
Senator from Vermont.